We're going to begin. Hello, everybody. My name is Nick Palodichuk, and I'm going to be the moderator for the first panel presentation of our show. So thanks for coming to Minnesota Comic Con 2023. I met Joel through my show, the St. Paul Filmcast, where I interview local filmmakers. Joel was nice to come on, but I think he was very well welcome because my show is surrounded by comic books, not so much film. So that was my first introduction to Joel. Joel's going to be here. We're going to talk about the previous history of Comic-Con and what we're happening now, as well as the transition. As you know, we're in a transition period with Minnesota Comic-Con, so we will have to have a conversation with that. But before we get into that, I would like to, let's give a warm welcome to Mr. Joel Thingvall.
Well, how did we get here? Well, comic fandom. You're going to find some common ties as we go through the next 40 minutes. Comic fandom, we forget how young we are. The comics didn't start till like 1939, 1940. Comics were predominantly for adults as much as they were for kids. It was a way that people learned how to read. You know, even in my generation, my parents, their parents were still, speaking the language from wherever they came from Europe. So comic books, and before that, comic strips. Some ways the pulp magazines for those that were a little more literate, were a way to get people to read. Now, comics were popular with the war audience, their dads and everything, in the 40s, and also the kids, because you had the beginnings of comic fans through the Superman fan club, Captain Marvel fan club. And then as comics graduated in the 50s, you had the EC fan addicts, which actually started publishing fanzines narrowly about EC comics. But otherwise, most of fandom at that time was combined with science fiction fandom. Now, science fiction fandom grew out of the pulps with Buck Rogers and Tarzan and everything else, and every year they would hold a World Science Fiction Convention somewhere, which people would come, California, New York, Oklahoma, whatever, and have fun talking about science fiction and some comics and all that. Comics didn't really start with an organized fandom until around '62, and that was an offshoot of the science fiction fandom, which was a zine called Zero, which was done by Dick Lupoff and his wife, who there's famous pictures of him dressed up as Captain Marvel, and his wife was Mary Marvel, and combined with a fellow named Jerry Bales, and in some ways Don and Maggie Thompson, who also came out of science fiction fandom. Now, Jerry Bales started because of DC Comics. He was a big All-Star fan and everything, and DC started to run letter pages with people's addresses in them so that you could actually get in touch with people. And so people started getting in touch and forming a fanzine that had 30 circulation or 50 or 75, and Jerry Bales kind of became a central place where they established the Alley Awards, and periodically people would come to his home in Ann Arbor, Michigan, 10, 20 people, and they would put together a fanzine, vote on stuff, and that was kind of like the beginnings of comic fandom. Now, the next big push was Marvel Comics. They opened up their ad pages, and you started to get price lists, but then you got the Southern Fandom Press Alliance, which was the foundation of the Rocket Blast comic collector. They put an ad in, it just took off. They went from Ditto and Mimeo to having to offset. Comic fandom became organized, in a sense. First big convention, New York City, 1965, although there was a similar convention right around that time in Detroit, which was a springboard off of Jerry Bales' efforts, but it was called the Triple Fanfare because it was comics, science fiction, and pop culture, which was founded by Sheldorf, who went on to create the San Diego Con. So that is where it all kind of started, a small group of fans in New York, and then it kept getting bigger and bigger. The first convention was fewer dealers than here, but panels all day long, 150, 200 people, and that would bring us to 1968 in Minnesota, there was a bunch of comic fans who were also members of, or who loved science fiction, and they helped establish the Minnesota Science Fantasy, which became Minicon, which became Convergence, and this was at the U of M. And there's names like Al Kufel, Dick Tachi, Ken Fletcher, who were students at the U of M, that they contributed to early versions of fanzines. And the first science fiction con was 1968. And then around 1970, 71, as comic fans started to show up, we didn't want to do any of the science fiction stuff. And we didn't want to listen to Clifford Simak, sad to say, and Larry Dixon, and other things like that. But the dealers were taking over the dealer's room. Now, science fiction fandom is interesting that they come and they take over the hotel, and they buy the hotel rooms, and they have party suites and walk around when, at that time, they would swing swords at each other in the hallways. And they have panels and everything else. But the dealer's room was kind of secondary. And as comic fans, we didn't want to pay $15, $20 just to go in and buy comic books.
Right, right.
So they did let us in for free as long as we didn't cross the threshold. Okay. So that's going to bring us to ask these people a question. What was their...
Yeah, we would like to know, because we like participation. What was you guys' first comic book con experience, if anybody would like to share with us?
Oakdale.
Oakdale?
Oakdale.
Okay.
Do you remember the year?
2002.
Okay.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Probably the San Diego Comic Con in 2002, where you could, this was before you had to buy a pass ahead of time. You could actually drive down there and get a badge the same day.
Kind of a little bit bigger, but
yeah.
Have you been to the San Diego?
I've been to San Diego 19 times.
Is 20s too many?
Yeah.
Does anybody else would like to share? Yes.
My first con was one of these in the Thunderbird. I can't remember the year.
2005 it was there.
Well, it was there before that because I was still living in Minnesota in 1995 in north central Wisconsin. So it was prior to 95. So.
That's my first experience with it.
That would have been mine too.
So I really liked going there. I lived in Mankato and commuted up to see the show or come to it. And,
Wonderful. The person behind you.
I don't know if it was a con, it was probably a comic book show at some Holiday Inn in downtown St. Paul, probably in like 1992 or something. One of those weekend kind of ballroom with.
They're always wearing hotels, right?
Yeah.
Have you ever gone to more than one convention in one day?
That's an interesting question. I don't think I could possibly handle it.
No.
I did. I went to the one, what was it? There was one in what's the F town here in Fridley, and then the one west of Minneapolis. It starts with an M. I can't remember. But there was also one in Bloomington, and I was telling everybody that there was 2 other shows going on, and this one guy selling comic books at the one in Bloomington goes, "Oh, so that's where everybody is." Yeah, and that was just like in 2018.
Yes, sir.
1976.
Wonderful.
I don't recall.
Curtis Hotel.
Thank you.
You were there too.
In Huntington.
Yes.
What was yours?
See, I'm a baby here, 2017. It was called Harvey and Ivy Con.
Okay.
It was in Minneapolis, I think. It had maybe like 15 vendors, that was it. But I ended up meeting a lot of people, and then just started going to all these shows after that.
So ask me, what was the first con?
For you, what was the first con?
Well, the first con, well, let me set the stage. There was a guy named David Murris who took an ad out in the buyer's guide saying comic books are an art form. In 1972 was the beginning of a beautiful friendship that I had with Dave, because I wrote him a 3-4 page letter, which when I went through his files, he passed away a few years ago, I expected to still find, but I didn't. I did find a letter from 1975. And I told him that no, comics are not an art form, it's a business, that they exploit creators and they are there to sell as many copies, and there's very little, whatever, but it was but yes, I do believe comics are an art form. But Dave did that. He handed out flyers at Minicon, got flyers up at Schindler's, a couple other places that had old comics, which was the Nicola Bookstore, Midway Book, Art Souls Books in Brooklyn Center, and started holding a backyard meeting. So again, we're coming back to a small group of people getting together. So they got together in Dave's backyard in Uptown. First 15, 20 people. The next month it was 30. The next month it was 50. Next month it was like 75. And got a little bit out of hand, if you can imagine. So decided, let's do a convention. So the first convention was November 1973 in a hall a bit smaller than this one here, Sheet Metal Workers Hall in South Minneapolis. There was probably a dozen dealers. I think we had a couple hundred people show up. We called it, what do you think we called it?
Starts with a W. If anybody can read it.
No, the first Milk and Cookie Time. Called it the Milk and Cookie Time because everyone showed up early with their big wad of money skipping breakfast. So Dave had free milk and cookies for everyone.
Skips breakfast right now, right?
And the other unique thing was that at a couple points during the convention, all dealing stopped because we're going to do a chalk talk with the guest artist. But that one was Chet Kozlak, who drew for the Golden Age Marvel or DC Comics, stuff like Atom, All-Star and that, and retired or left that and came to Minnesota and worked for the Golden Rule and then worked for the Historical Society, painting all those dioramas you used to see behind wildlife exhibits and all the different places. And Chet still had like 50 pieces of Golden Age artwork by different artists, none of his own, because they gave him Golden Age artwork to use as a guide when he was drawing the characters. So Chet would do a chalk talk with the big easel and would draw Atom and Flash and all that stuff. Then people would go back to dealing, and it's like, we're going to show cartoons. Everyone stop. Everyone would go sit on the floor or whatever, and they would show cartoons for half an hour. So that was the first convention. And then there were a couple others, still at the Sheet Metal Workers Hall. And then in 1974 was a Curtis Hotel. 1975, also Curtis. And, no, was it that right? 74? Yeah. And in 76. And Dave got burnt out pretty much because it kept getting bigger, more dealer-oriented. This small group of people just didn't really care about panels. The first conventions, we had an art room, we had panels, we had a film program from 7 to midnight, running movies, you know, and finally, you know, only like 20 people came to that, so that was like one of the first things to go.
At this time, I think I'd like to bring up somebody, maybe a name that people might have known, but I would like to bring up to you. Tell us about CC then.
Oh, we're doing the conventions, and all of a sudden this little guy walks up, out of the blue, and says, I'm CC Beck. CC Beck, the creator of Captain Marvel, came with the Twin Cities, just out of the blue when we were doing a convention. Well, it's not out of the blue because we forget that CC Beck was born in Zumbrota. Fawcett comics were originally published in Robbinsdale.
I didn't know this.
Okay, and his brother lived on the River Road. So every year he came up from Florida, where he was living, and to visit his brother. So from then on, we paid his senior citizen airfare, and he came up and was a guest at our convention. He always would come up a couple days early, loved going to the Jolly Troll Buffet. You know, that was a highlight. And then he would play his ukulele in the bar afterwards in the hotel. Now, the reason we did hotels in the old days was everyone took the bus. Okay? All buses led to downtown Minneapolis. If you lived in White Bear Lake, if you lived in Brooklyn Center, if you lived in Richfield, you would hop the bus and go downtown because you bought you were of age to buy comic books at Schindler's. And they always had 300 compared to your local drugstore that had 2 copies of FF1 and 2 people beat you to it, then you had to go to another drugstore 4 miles away and hope that they had it or something.
be nice because you're a kid and you didn't have a driver's license yet. You could take the bus and go to downtown.
Yeah, and that was why we tended to be in downtown. Plus, they set up the tables for you and everything else. But we were running into the issues that they didn't want to rent to us tie it up for 3 nights because they'd rather have a food function, which was a greater profit, from a wedding or whatever, or an event like that. Even though it's like, name your price, see if we can work with it.
It's like, we'll take it $5 extra more than them.
and eventually, that is why Dave did the conventions through 76. Someone else actually produced the 76, and Dave just did the programming. And then he unfortunately stiffed the Curtis Hotel. And then I decided to come back in 77, and I did it at the Hotel Dykeman, which was one of the biggest dives in the Twin Cities, and claim to fame was it was the offices of the AWA Wrestling Association.
Oh, hey!
At one point, and then joined forces with Dave in 78, and we did them through 83. Then went to the Leamington, Sheraton Ritz, Holiday Inn, whatever hotel we could get for the days that we wanted. The pain was that in Minnesota, you have to pick spring or fall, because everyone's busy in the summer. You have to try and get earlier than November 1st because you might have snow, which we could have had today. So your windows are pretty limited, and you have to work 6 months or a year in advance. And after 83, I couldn't get a hotel to give us 6 months in advance. They just kept putting it off, and it's like, this is too much effort, too much time. And happily, John and Nunziata continued them in St. Paul because he had the prom center across from his store. And let's talk about what?
Well, when we're bringing it into downtown in like the 80s, to even entice people, you had to bring at least some kind of notoriety, some famous people. Can you just, I want you to bring up just a few of the famous people that you got, guests that you got to do.
Our biggest one was Dave was also very much interested. He was not a superhero fan. He was a cartoon fan and loved animation. And at one point we did a conjunction with the Walker Art Center. We brought Bob Clampett in, and they did a retrospective of his work at the Walker Art Center. Plus, he was a guest at our convention, brought his Beady puppet and Cecil puppet. I have a picture of my ex-wife getting a Cecil slurp, while I'm holding her arms and back like dishonest John. Happily, I had ties with Marvel Comics, and I convinced Jim Shooter to come, and he liked it so much that he came a second time on his own dime, and also then through Carol Kalish, who came and brought Chris Claremont, Terry Austin.
Recognize
the writer.
Yeah. But again, you always had the problem that can an artist predict where they're gonna what their job situation is going to be? Do they have work that they have to finish that weekend or whatever? You're going to have the Wendy Penny come, but then she got bogged down, from one of our last shows and that. Managed to get John Byrne to come, as a featured guest once, and the joy was that he got to be delivered back to the airport by my parents.
They know how to get there.
I will add on that. I think Mom said that she picked him up from the airport,
yes.
And he spent the entire drive complaining about the upholstery in her car.
Yeah. Yes.
John Byrne.
What color was it? I feel.
No, I think she had a Firebird.
Oh.
James Rockford car.
You mentioned animation. Today is actually National Animation Day for the country.
I did not know that.
You can look it up on your phone. Go ahead.
We're at the right spot.
I believe you.
Yeah.
But even with all those famous people coming, there's a little bit of a downside with the mid-80s, with the kind of like you call it the black hole.
Yeah, it was just, we kind of burnt out. We had kids, both Dave and I, and it was just taking too much time, too much of a hassle. Things were in tradition. And, and we were only, 30, 35 years old then,
Right.
And, someone did manage to get the Holiday Inn over by the U of M campus, I think in '84. And then again, John did at the Prom Center, but no one went to St. Paul in those days, you know?
Yeah, the 80s, right. Yeah, you can throw a rock and not hit anybody.
Yeah, I mean, and happily, I've lived in St. Paul, and I like to say the joy of St. Paul is that I'm more than happy to go to Minneapolis anytime. The joy is no one comes to visit you.
Well, at this time, I would like to, because we talked about everybody's experience of their first cons, but Joel and I would like to, if you guys share, what's your first experience going to a comic book store?
Yeah, what was your first comic book store?
Let's go ahead.
There were, in Northwood, Iowa, there was a little grocery store called Fallcon, and my grandmother would drive down there to get groceries. They lived right along the state line of Iowa and Minnesota, and that's my first experience with comics. She would let me pick out a couple every
Just in the
time.
grocery store.
When I was like 6 years old or even younger.
I grew up in the Fox Valley, and they all supported Senator McCarthy, so comic books were banned. Like in Kaukauna.
Was it like an official ban?
Yeah, well, no one sold them. No grocery stores, no gas stations, nothing.
Which Senator McCarthy are you talking about?
Joseph or whatever his name.
Oh, Joe McCarthy
Joe
from
McCarthy.
Wisconsin.
Yeah, exactly.
So Fox Valley in Wisconsin.
Right. Yes.
Okay. Apple.
Yes, and people have vandalized his grave 17 times over. But anyways,
Okay.
when my family went down to the World's Fair in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I was just, this high, and I saw the Dazzler comic by Bill Skankowitz. I was like, whoa, what the heck is this, man? This is so cool, and they had... And it was the World's Fair, so it's the Marvels, Yeah, it was really neat.
Does anybody like to share?
Sure. I was lucky in the town where I grew up in Austin, Minnesota, and there was a bookstore. It was called Men's Book and Tobacco, and they had everything. I mean, comics, paperbacks, hardcovers, lots and lots of stuff. And so that wasn't really a comic book store, but that's where I got my comics until I was quite a bit older. And I guess maybe because this particular place has been in and out of, and I'm back into comic books again, and reading books. That is my absolute favorite brick and mortar bookstore. And when I went, they were in Dinky Town at the time, so I always try to stop by just about every time I'm in the Twin Cities. It's just been a great experience for decades for me. So.
Great stuff.
Yeah, one of the first places to get comic books outside of your corner drugstore and everything was Uncle Hugo's, which was an offshoot of the science fiction convention. So they carried some comics, and then but not really back issues. Again, it was like Nicola Bookstore, Midway Book, before Tom Stransky. Tom worked for Nicola, then ended up going to Midway and then buying that, But the first real comic book store was Comic City, which sprang up in 1974. One of the founders, Bob Selvig, was at a table right around the corner here, with two twins named the Humphrey brothers, who eventually moved to California, and Mike Rosen, who recently passed away just a few weeks ago, started the Comic City, totally exclusively comics, right on the cusp of the direct market. So you could buy your comics for 45 to 50% off, but you couldn't return them. I won't tell you about all the unscrupulous things that did do to return them, because you could still return them. But the common thing was, Schindler's, when they sold new comics, they got them for 20% off from Gopher News, but they could return them. Gopher News didn't always. They had stopped ripping off tops and fudge the things, because they ran a store called Downtown Book in St. Paul, and also Downtown Book in Duluth. And you could go in there and find 2 to 3 years worth of comics of a specific title.
I've been there.
Yeah, and it sold well in Duluth because you had all the guys going out on boats that were looking for stuff to read.
Right.
And then, the next major comic store was Greg Ketter, who with Mike Domowski and Ralph Johnson did something called the Minnesota Collective. by what was the State Theater, and then Greg opened up a store in St. Paul, which lasted not even half a year, and then did Complete Enchanter, which was in Dinkytown above the drugstore in Dinkytown, and then eventually morphed it into Dreamhaven.
Yep. Is that still there then?
Dreamhaven is now in
East
East 38th in South Minneapolis.
Okay.
And Greg did both. He did science fiction and comics, kind of straddled fantasy. Great guy, got into publishing and everything else. Then the next person that came in was John Annunziata with St. Paul Comics, in which he had a hole in the wall by where Sears is in St. Paul, then moved to one location and ended up over by the downtown hockey rink and everything. And from there sprung, what is Uncle Ken's store? That's Uncle Sven's.
Sven.
That was an offshoot of St. Paul Comics. It was a place where the new comics came in to break them out, to get them prepped to go on the shelves at John's. And then Ken just opened up on the weekends, and then that developed into a longtime store. And then we started getting in the 80s, and we started getting into Mind's Eye and Cedar Cliff. And, Schindler's didn't really carry back issues right away, not until about 77. And the fun thing about Schindler's was that they would take their most expensive comic books and they'd put a 3x5 card in there, $25. And they would have the racks hanging from the ceiling by chains, and they would put them in there. And you would buy the comic, and you get home, and you would take the index card out, and the comic had all faded except for the scarves.
What about the college or comic book knowledge?
Okay, now Comic City ran until I was her first employee in 74, and I owned it from 80 to 82, and then we eventually sold out to a guy named Gary Sislaw who didn't pay his bills, got evicted, moved next to Lund's. But Ralph and Chris, who both owned the store when I was there, lived in the house and back. Comic City was a mom and pop grocery store. Next door was an appliance repair store, which became insurance offices, in a 3-bedroom house. So they moved in the next day, got a rush shipment from Capital City. They were still kind of doing mail order, and opened the College of Comic Book Knowledge, Comic College, which, so we considered Comic City, Comic College, Nostalgia Zone, which is another story, are all basically offshoot of the same thing. 45 years on the same corner until it was sold for redevelopment. And now Comic College is out in Roseville.
There's a great picture of you guys in front of that building.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then we had Hot Comics, which was big, 1, 2, 3, 4. We had stores pop up in Fargo, Grand Forks, Duluth, St. Cloud. And then, kind of had a regression where, things tightened up. A lot of stores have disappeared.
Does anybody else want to share before we move on?
Other than my dime store comic in my hometown drugstore, first comic store I went to was Comic Book College on Hennepin.
Yeah.
And shortly after them, I went through like Outpost. I don't know if you're familiar with them.
Yep.
Then in my hometown in the 90s, we had a true comic book and sports card store called Drew's.
Yep.
They went under when the sports card market. They had a sweet deal on comics. Pre-order, you got 30% off cover.
Yes. Yep. Yep. So many places set up their lists. And
first convention I went to was, I think it was at one of in the mid-80s in Minneapolis, I think. It's one of the hotels or convention center. I remember I got a good deal on Action 252 then. The list price back then was like $50 for it. I got it for $45.
You used to joke, you'd set up a comic book store because then people would bring you comics. Rather than meet them in an alley. Yep.
Mine was a comic book store / card store, and the owner didn't really make as much money with the comics because he didn't price them right. They made like a ton of money off of the Magic and baseball cards for a while. So
Magic's usually what keeps comic stores open right now.
Yeah. You know,
Pokemon as well, yes.
You know, the thing about comic book stores was that you would talk to a person in business and you would sit there and say that I'm only getting stuff for 50% off, and you know, forgive me, other places do get stuff for 70 or 80% off, so then they can remain with them. But the joy of a comic book store was that you would keep 10, 20% of the 100, 200, 300, 500,000 comics, and it would be 50 cents, 75 cents, $1, $2, $3, whatever, in a matter of 6 months or a year. So suddenly, you know, your profit margin was huge. But then everyone started thinking that, oh, I can open up a comic book store in my town or my area, and my friends will come and buy comics to help support my collection. And actually, one may walk in the door, and I might be able to buy it for, because I don't know, for $20.
Yeah, we used to have 5 comic book stores in Eau Claire, and now we have 1.
Yeah.
Did you want to share?
Yeah, so there was this little tiny shop where I grew up. I grew up in Brook Heights. I'd be biking down the road, I drive by it all the time. All I see was games. I decided to stop off in the back room and comic books. And that's the first time I bought it. There was a Lobo series. That was the first comic book I actually bought myself, was a Lobo series. And like 4 days later, the place shuts down. My first experience was a little tiny hole in the wall that shuts down in 4 days after it.
And
Story 3 act.
yeah, even the source. The source, you know, is gaming. Besides comics,
Yeah,
they're
gaming.
they're probably one of the larger, you know, comics outfits now. But we forget that Schindler's at one time expanded to 11 stores. They bought adult material to the suburbs. No one noticed. I haven't quite figured that out. But Schindler's at one point was probably the 5th or 6th largest orderer of new comics in the country. They were the second behind Graham Crackers, I think, in the Midwest. They moved a tremendous amount of books because they had the penetration in all the different suburbs, besides Pogs and everything else.
Speaking of gaming, because I remember when the source moved to their new location from the corner store, where the fast foods are. Where the fast foods, that's where the source is now. But the transition when they were moving, all the gamers cut the fence so they had easy access to the fast food place.
Oh my God.
So they don't have to go around to walk on this dangerous sidewalk. They just clip the fence so they can get easy access to it.
Man.
Yeah.
The Arby's, you mean?
Yeah.
And the original source was the other
Gamers
side.
think ahead.
Was the other side of 94 on Snelling Avenue, next to
It's the Warner Stallion now.
video store.
Across from Dino's.
Oh.
Well, I just want to point out, we're getting into the last 10 minutes or so of the panel. Do we want to start getting into where we got into the fairground?
Okay, yeah, let's get into the fairgrounds.
Okay.
Okay. Fairgrounds, 1988. Group of fans got together at the Annie's Parlor. Again, a group of fans. And they said, let's do a convention. So they did them at the Maplewood Community Center. Probably 25 tables, or probably equivalent to this side. And then it got bigger, and they went to the Thunderbird. Thunderbird, the worst hotel in the world, because you had to use the elevators and the wings to bring up stuff, or carry them up the steps, or carry them down steps if you were a dealer. But you couldn't ask for a better atmosphere.
Oh, yes.
And then from the Thunderbird, Nick Post became involved. He had contacts at the Minnesota State Fair because of his 1919 root beer stand, and did at the Education Building, the Eco Building, and then
move into the
grandstand. And my favorite memory of those shows were 2. I got to chauffeur Russ Heath around. Russ Heath is a gentleman in the sense that he has an eye for the ladies. And I remember taking him after the Friday show. He wanted to go and visit a strip club, which and still to this day haven't been in, so I dropped him off. Told me he could call me whenever so that I could take him back. Yeah. But Russ always had a story that he worked at the Playboy Mansion because he was working on Little Annie Fanny with Harvey Kurtzman and everyone. so he stayed there when he was working, and he would always hang out in the dorm of the pets, or the, whatever, and one mother was coming through once with her daughter who was going to go work for Playboy, and they said that, yes, we'll all shop around and everything, and they said, but who's that guy over there? Well, that's just Russ. He was harmless, and he was actually probably harmless. And the other one was Murphy Anderson and his wife came to town. And this was a fun thing that came in early because they heard about, they're devout Catholics, and they heard about all the great Catholic architecture from the cathedrals in both Minneapolis and St. Paul, as well as a lot of the other churches. And one fan got to show for them all around town. He took pictures of all the different architectures and stained glass windows.
So from the stake round, it kind of grew organically to just a little, like we said, a group like this, till you get to the big, well, now the state fairgrounds. But then it blossomed into a traveling kind of franchise like the Wizards and all that stuff, and it exploded so much.
Yeah, then we started to get, Wizard. Fred Greenberg came in, who was doing Great Northeastern Convention. I was trying to do national ones where you would take an ad out in a comic book and advertise 5, 6 different shows, across the country. He actually was at our shows in the 70s. Then you had Wizard that came in and tried the same thing, but the expenses got to be, huge when you start talking convention.
Started imaging going.
Oh yeah. And so now we got the celebrity conventions. We have this starting to try to come back with fan friendly. We've always had weekend comic marts.
Comic shows.
Yes.
Just like for
which I've done myself at the Radisson Mart or the Sheraton Midway, just a one-day thing. 25 dealers, 150 diehard comic book fans show up. And now, Comic Con is wondering where they should go, keep going from.
Right, because we've done small, massive, big.
Yeah, but it all comes out, sometime it gets big, people start wearing out, COVID didn't help, and then it all of a sudden disappears. Like this one just kind of was good, all of a sudden, no Comic Con. But then, we heard this was the last Comic Con, and a week later, it's back.
It's all about fans. Fans make it alive.
It's all about fans and new generations of fans coming in.
So at this time, I think, if you have a question.
Yeah, actually, because I remember when you were in the grandstand for a few years, remember getting to meet and get some framed shows signed on those sorts of things. Is he ever going to come back to Minnesota?
It's always interesting when you deal with guests. The initial thought was you want to get some old timers for the people who've been around a long time, because one, don't cost as much because they can fly cheaper. And then I think Hot Comics helped sponsor Adam Hughes when he was coming, through ties with people and like that. And what you run into a lot now is a guest conned out, like going to other shows. You can only do so many a year. How many people want to come to Minnesota? I've talked,
especially now.
Yeah, I've talked constantly to Eric Larson. Eric Larson, Savage Dragon fame. He was born in Minnesota. He lived here about 45 minutes, I think. Probably like a week.
Too cold.
He doesn't, if he was a guest at the show today, he would be mad because he doesn't like cold weather.
Right.
He wants to guarantee that it's going to be a certain temperature, if his schedule would permit or work out,
He's been to the card one twice.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead, sir.
More comic book professional creators with Minnesota ties: Charles Schultz, Wally Wood, Mike Klug.
Yeah, But so many of them are deceased.
Charles died a few years ago.
Charles Schultz said it was twisting his arm to get him to come to town in '95, where he came for something with Camp Snoopy, because he didn't fly any more than what he had to, And not that we didn't have moments when we tried. We tried in 1977 to get an exhibit of Charles Schultz at the Minnesota Historical Society, and they said, it's not old enough.
Right.
You know, short stints and all that.
Yeah,
that sort of purchase. And you know, that was, you know, we try, but the market now is pretty much like for dealers. How many people come here for comic book dealers? You know, and you want out-of-town dealers. An out-of-town dealer is going to come if it's a 2-day show, first off. For every 1,000 fans, you can go out another state. You know, if you get 2,000 fans, you get Iowa, Chicago, Wisconsin pretty easily. If you get 4,000 fans, you might get Ohio, Indiana, Texas. You know, if we ever get to 10,000 fans, then you might get other places. You know, you forget San Diego was not always the mecca for Comic Cons. It was actually Chicago. Because New York got too expensive, Philadelphia didn't work out. Everyone could come to Chicago from New York, California, and didn't cost as much as going all across country. You know, partly the reason Mid-Ohio or Heroes Con in North Carolina is very popular. It's an easy drive from New York City. It's not that far from Florida, which has had trouble doing regular conventions.
Right, the locations.
Yeah.
I kind of noticed there's a lot of like anime conventions in Minnesota. Has there ever been like a way to like, hey, if you guys want to cross promote with anime conventions, I'll bring in like some of the anime people in.
You know,
stuff.
They're very siloed fan bases, I would say, and that is something that me and Kyle and the Minnesota Comics Exchange has looked into. It's very niche. It's very popular with the younger generation, but that's now like kids growing up, and then it's harder to get sub 15-year-old, children into the comic book community. As it is like here, you can get your parents to bring you out, but that is more of probably something that would be a celebrity convention, I would say, because not everybody knows the artists and writers of manga yet, as they do comics, in my opinion. So.
It is an idea. It's, what you start running into, that is your growth just aiming for a certain audience and doing it as best as possible, like comics. I tell people that San Diego, if you're an old comic collector, the amount of people selling old comics take up as much floor space today as they did in the 70s when it was at the El Cortez Hotel. The convention has just grown 10 times. Yeah.
And then a couple things to build on that is all the Minnesota anime conventions are run by a guy who's kind of notoriously hard to work with.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So look up Ryan Kopp if you've never heard of him before. And one good thing is there's a convention called Convergence, which is about trying to bring together all the various fandoms that happens down in Minneapolis every year.
I think it's in the summer, right?
Yeah, it's usually July, August. And they're about like, hey, let's get the Doctor Who fans and the anime fans and the sci-fi fantasy fans and the comic fans to get together. And they do have dealers and they do have an art room too, but they're a largely panel-driven con. So it is nice when you do have conventions that are about like, hey, let's get all these people thrown together and have them talk with each other.
It's like back when I said we did a film program, we ended up only having 20 people come.
Right.
You bring a wrestler in hoping to get wrestlers because wrestling is kind of cartoony, right? You bring in, used to be TV old celebrities because it might bring another 150, 200, 300 people in, but then they don't necessarily, or that you have to bring in enough to justify people selling anime,
Yes.
wrestling, toys, whatever. And how do you get these different groups to mesh and combine for one, give me pop culture event,
Right, it's hard to.
And
how do you
all of a sudden,
advertise that widespread?
Then it starts to get more and more expensive.
The target market gets too wide, and then it gets a little bit harder.
Yeah.
So I noticed we're running a little bit close to time here. Does anybody have any last comments or questions before we conclude?
Thank you very much for imparting your great Minnesota comic history.
It's so young. It's so young. You know, and the thing is, I mean, you know, comics have long been driven by dealers. You know, we run into the pain that stores don't like comic book conventions because it's people that just set up for the day or the whatever that take away from my business. And I was always against that. It's like, you know, the Smart Store took an ad out in the program, which is going in the hands of 1,000 people. You know, I used to tell Shinders, you don't have to be here. Buy a table. Put coupons to get people in your store next week for, you know, sale discounts for 4 weeks. You know, or have a person in a, you know, costume hand them out. You know?
I will say most vendors nowadays have 2 separate stocks. One for shows and one that stays at the store. Issues needed, never bring store stuff. Unless it's a huge book, Tim, comic book, or Granite City, he doesn't bring anything out of his store. It comes out of the storage locker.
Comic City, Comic College, we used to bring what was called reader copies. Comics all very good or less. We would show up and people would say, there's not a backer board on this. You know, as we're jamming it back in the box. And it's like, you know, no matter how hard you jam it, you're not gonna wreck it any more than it already is. And we don't want to carry that much cardboard in each one of these long boxes, 150 long boxes that were, you know.
Good.
All adds up.
And you could go home with, you know, a stack of comics like that for $200. You know.
The Quad Cities Con is starting to do them at dead malls. So you've heard of this? So they take over all these like empty stores. Oh, and you've been to them,
There was one just in St. Cloud a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah. And we also have what's the uncanny experience?
Uncanny experience. That's more of a fan con, but that was really fun. They had a vendor hall similar to the size of the gym, and then the rest of it was all based on like X-Men fandom. If you love X-Men, it's the place to be.
That's why it's called Arcade.
It was done in a big old house. The Minneapolis Club.
Minneapolis Club, beautiful venue.
Like the X-Men match.
Yeah, pretty much. Cool. It was very fun. Sponsored.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
Was
I saw the picture.
Gambit Brewery, so there was like a big, you know, mutant after party, and that was pretty good. Karaoke.
We get people that want to buy comic books. We get people that want to dress up. You know, cosplaying has become so huge in the last 10 years. And the last state fair shows, they, you know, would do a great cosplay setup and exhibit and get pictures taken. You know, back in the old days, I used to talk with a Marvel promotion person. I'd sit there and say, why are you spending all this money going to San Diego and stuff like that? You should be doing car shows with Batman and people in costumes, getting pictures, reaching a whole new audience, handing out, you know, free little comics like what they were giving out at Halloween's. Work in the state fairs. Marvel Comics has a booth at the Minnesota State Fair. Wouldn't that be fun?
Oh yeah.
You know, with Spider-Man, and you could, you know, job in local artists. You know, you're promoting interest in comic books to an audience that is not already interested in comic books. Yeah.
There you go. And reading. Not enough reading these days, probably.
And
that's that reading the screen is terrible.
And kids oriented. It's still like, you know, how do you do Comic Cons? We're going to do anime, but how do we get the kids who are reading Captain Underpants? And, you know, Diary of a Wimpy Kid. I mean, these are huge. You know?
Yeah, the Bone comics just went skyrocketing.
Yes. Yep.
Well, at this time, I'd like to thank Chris Anderson from Minnesota Comic Exchange to help out.
Yeah, check them out. Join them on Facebook.
Yeah, Minnesota Comic Exchange. But what's our But let's give a round of applause to Mr. Joel Thingvall. You can still hanging out, right?
And if you go on Facebook, type in David Muruz, M-R-U-Z, Memorial. I've set up a page on comic book history, you know, which everything that Dave was a big fan of comic history. I'm still trying to get stuff in, but you can see old con pictures, old programs, all the different artists that have Minnesota roots, like someone mentioned Wally Wood, you know, which was from the Iron Range and went to West High School, stuff in the yearbook. You know, we forget besides Dan Jurgens, Kirk Swan was from Minnesota. Wayne Boring was from Minnesota. Carl Barks, who did Uncle Scrooge, worked for the Calgary Eye Opener and was in an apartment building over by where MCAT is now. You know, again, C.C. Beck of Captain Marvel fame. We've had people like Ralph Heimdall, who did Bugs Bunny newspaper strip. You know.
Let's give a round of applause. Thanks again.